YouTube. Hi, my name is Mark, and this is Nixon Motorsports. This channel is all about motorsports, from racing to exotic cars and even simulators. Today's video, I will bring you along and show you the steps in preparing a motorcycle engine for installation in the race car. I think you'll find it of interest. All right, let's get into it. Come on. So here is the new 2022 ZX10R motor, and it's fresh back from the dyno. That's the only time it has on it actually is dyno. So it's basically a stock motor. There are a few tweaks to it. Obviously it has race cams in it, heavier duty valve springs. It has heavier duty clutch basket springs, which you need when you start pushing engines like this with a big fat tire like these cars have on them. I have to convert this to dry sump, so I'll be modifying the engine for that. I take off this cooler. We do not use that. You follow it. So there's a handful of just things that have to be done to get it in the car. But the engine itself, a little higher compression. You know, for the most part, it's a stock motor, but there's those extra little tuning features to it. This engine actually 220 horse on the dyno with the OEM ECU 4-into-1 headers. Not too bad. With my Motec setup, you know, I've seen 223, 224 plus in that range. So anyway, let's start getting this motor prepped and ready to get it in the car. So let me pan down here as I prep for putting the dry sump system on the race car. So here's a handful of parts that I need. In fact, all the way over here, but let's start here. So this is the oil pan itself. You can tell it's very low profile. Here's just a new gasket, and it's got two scavenge lines for it. In fact, here's the scavenge pump itself. So you can see the two ports for inputs. This is actually driven off the oil pump shaft directly, so I'll show you that as we do it. This little part is the adapter where the oil cooler was on the engine. So this is used for a pressure line output here, and then fuel gauge, or excuse me, oil pressure sensor pickup. This little guy, you're probably wondering what that is. This is nothing more than a small little adapter. It plugs in here once the engine's in the race car. One end mounts to the inside. If I flip this up here in the bottom of the pan, and the other side of this goes into the oil tank. So this feeds oil into the system itself, obviously to the oil pump, right? So that's what that is. Now, to mount the oil pump, the scavenge pump, I always go with a brand new, this is the water pump housing, one half of the water pump housing. I always buy a brand new one and use that when I put motors together. Here's why. I'm somewhat lazy to a degree. You don't want any of the standard, they have two bearings in there. Normally they have a oil seal, and then they have a water seal as well. You don't want any of those in here. The only thing that is used is this O-ring here in the oil pump itself that slides in this orifice, right? So for that reason, I buy a brand new one. And then this is a small little weep hole here in the bottom. And it's very important that you seal that with a appropriate length hex nut like I have in here. And you want to Loctite that thing. You want that thing to be obviously solid, right? Because you do have some fluid from the back side of this, by the way, is the oil pump. So you will have some fluid in here, and you really want this to be sealed so you don't make a mess all over your engine bay, okay? Last couple parts. So this will go on the, this goes on the clutch cover, if I can think here. This is simply a breather line up into your oil tank. And this is this is a stock thermostat housing for the ZX10R. And you're wondering probably, well, what do I have this for? What's the big deal? I actually, two things. I seal it here. Normally there's a small little weep hole in case it overheats or whatever not. So I seal that up, and you can't quite see it possibly, but I remove the thermostat. So this is simply a housing, no thermostat whatsoever for the engine. These are the scavenge lines themselves for the oil pan from the scavenge pump. And over here I have my pneumatic air shifter, a little J-arm. This is the ignition trigger wheel cover. And I simply use this as a reference. I have to modify it and put a DTM connector on there for my, my application, right? Anyway, that's a handful of the parts. So enough talking. Let's start pulling the pan off and getting this motor prepped, and we'll talk about it on the way. All right, so first up I'm going to pull the pan off here. Grab myself some rags, and they're all I think it's 8mm on these guys. So let's pull them off. There should not be very much oil in this thing. George is always pretty good about draining oil before he ships motors. I just keep these pans on the shelf, you know, if I ever need them again. But yeah, that's all that is. So I don't even bother taking off the oil filter. I just use a box end wrench here on this side. There we go. All right, so that is the bottom side of a OEM oil pan itself. Now, there is this pressure relief valve in here. You do need to reuse that in your dry sump system. I already have one in my pan I'm going to use, so I'll just leave this one alone, but just so you know. And then from there, this is the, oh, and there's plenty of oil in that. This is the oil pickup tube that you need to remove. And this little hose guy here, I think this is just a drain back into the tank. This thing I need to pull off at the bottom, which I'll do here in a second. The gasket I remove, I always put a new gasket on. I've done both. You can get away with reusing a gasket. This motor's new, just dyno time as I mentioned, but I do not like oil leaks, so I always put a new gasket in. And so I just got to clean it up a little bit, get this thing ready to put the other pan on. So this time of year it can get quite cold out here in Texas. I got the sniffles going on. I'm not sick, I'm just freezing my ass off out here in the shop. All right, come on, you. There we go. That's it, it just presses in there. So here's my new gasket. I need to clean this up a little bit more before I get it in. I just set this over here off the side. And it will mount this way. So there's a small oil seal here from that original pickup tube. You need to take that off. So instead on this pan, there's an O-ring in place there instead. So I'm just taking off the kind of the debris from the previous gasket, right? See if I can not make too big of a mess. Yeah, this Honda Bond, it's pretty good stuff. Just a light coating on it. You can see I just used my finger. I use the same bolts from the stock pan. So that's it. Just goes on this way. You got to kind of give it a little pop to go in there. It's that that O-ring itself, so I just give it a little tap. There we go. Kind of moving around free before I start to tighten anything. I go by feel on torquing these bolts down. I'm sure there's a spec that you should follow, but I just go by feel. So I just wipe off some of the excess gasket goop before it dries. You don't need to, of course, but. All right, so let me pan down here. I have the new dry sump pan in place. I put a new gasket in. You saw with the Honda Bond gasket cement. I use that as well. So it's in place. Next, I need to turn to the oil cooler, remove this, and put the adapter on. So from this side, let's do that next, and go from there. Okay. Okay, so I unbolted the cooler. Let's take this thing off. Okay, so that's all it is. Pretty simple. And let's just clean that up just a little bit. Now the adapter that I'm going to put on, has O-rings, so makes it really, really simple. Let me go down here. Here's the adapter plate that I use, so I need to put that right here. Bolt that in place. I'll probably use a little bit of a blue thread locker on it, just as a safety protocol, if you will. But this will be one of the high pressure lines for the coolant system itself. All right, oil pan, the oil filter adapter plate is on the engine. So again, motor's still upside down. Let me just pan down here again. So this is the adapter plate that is needed. We do not use the cooler that comes with the engine, so that's removed. We use an external one. And this plate, so we use this AN port as one of the high pressure lines. Here are two 1/8 inch holes here for sensors. I use one sensor for my oil pressure here. And that's as simple as it is. These two ports are for the scavenge pump hoses. And if I pan over here, this port here in the rear, this is for oil inlet from the oil tank. And all the way over here on this side, this is the other high pressure line AN fitting. So that and this will be in the loop for high pressure. All right, so now I'm gonna spin the motor around. The bottom side's done. I'm gonna spin it on its side and get working on the oil pump itself and show you what that's like. Okay, so as I prepare for the oil sump, the pump itself, it mounts right here. I need to take this water pump housing apart. I will not be using any part of this. I'll have a new piece I put in place here, so I need to pull that off. I'll do that next. And quite simple. You got an 8mm bolt here, I believe one here and one here, and this is just a drain, so you leave that alone. But do that and this whole thing will slide off. Once I do that, I'll bring you back, of course, and show you steps. Another change I'll have to do is the gear position sensor. So I use a DTM 4-pin connector, so I'll need to either modify this or I'll swap this around with one of my other sensors already configured. So anyway, let's pull this thing off and I'll show you what that looks like. All right, so I took the outer half of the water pump off with those 3 bolts, and here's what it looks like. Here's the impeller itself and such. From this point, it's quite simple. Just use a screwdriver and carefully find a place you can pry this up very slightly. One hand with the camera makes it hard, but here, let me see if I can get it this way. Okay, so back on this thing, as I pull the bottom half out, it's seated in there, it's a little snug. Once you break the seal, and you do not need to take this impeller off. Once you break this seal, it simply just slides out, just like that. And so as I pan down here, there's some water. Let me spin it over here. So you can see the back side of it. This is part of the oil pump itself. So that rotor actually mates or sits inside this, and it spins around, and that's what actually creates or that is the oil pump itself. So there's a spline down on the bottom down there. Let me try to clean this up a little bit. That is what drives the new pump, the scavenge pump that we're going to put in here. Okay, so I'll be right back. So I went ahead and replaced the gear position sensor with the 4-pin DTM that I use for my Motec system. It's not a big deal. It's just 4 pins. 2 are tied together for 2 channels. That's it. So threw that in there, and now I need to focus on the second part of the pump. So let me spin over to the bench. So this is what I removed from the car, from the engine, sorry. As I pointed that out earlier, this is part of the oil pump itself. And if you look closely, you look inside there, there's a small pin inside this impeller. It will not come off this way. The only way to remove that is to pull this shaft out, and you need to take this 10 mil bolt out for the water impeller itself. So let me do that, and then I'll show you the next steps. All right, so I took the bolts and this water impeller off. Now this pin will actually just slide out, as you can see. Now if you notice, at that point there's this small little pin. Let me set it down so you can see it. See that little pin? I was able to slide that out, and once you do that, the oil impeller portion here, you're able to slide out. So that's as simple as it is to remove it. Now let's go ahead and get that installed on the new oil pump and housing setup, and let me show you how that works. All right, so I set the camera down. Hopefully you can see this. So what I need to do now is get the scavenge oil pump ready and mount it and so on. So let me just show you how you do it first. This actually will just simply slide through here, and you'll be able to just push it forward and spin it around. You'll find the bolts actually align, right? Once you do that, if you can see, the shaft actually shows the hole here for this pin. You'll need to put that pin through like this, if you can see it, and instead of the shaft going on this way, or the impeller piece, you'll actually turn it around because it needs to be driven, right? And you'll find it where it will slot right in up against the water, or up against the the oil pump itself. So that's how you actually get this prepped and ready. Now I'll need to, it's a new housing here, I'll need to put this O-ring on, so I'll do that here in a second. But once you do that, then you're able to slide this into the engine, and this keyway here, or this slit in this pin, this is what actually drives the entire oil pump too, right? The internal oil pump and the scavenge pump. So there's a notch in the shaft inside the engine that you'll need to align this on, but that's what that is. So with that, let's pull this apart. I've already cleaned this up a bit. So all I'm doing at this point is oiling these O-rings up a touch, right? Which is a good idea. So put a little bit of just engine oil around this this O-ring. Before I put this in the engine too, I'll actually put some oil in the scavenge pump here, just so it has a little bit of lubrication. So at that point, I can actually slide this in, and you can hear it kind of pop into place like that. Spin it around so that thing's ready to go. And before I get too far carried away here, I'll put this O-ring on the housing. So put a little oil on this guy, bring it around, slap it in place. So you can see that's ready to go at that point. So then before I install, I put the pin in, like I showed you, and just a little bit of oil on this rotor. Usually a pretty good idea to do that. And at that point, I can slide this in, and you can see it slide in place there like that, right? So now this is ready to actually slide into the car, so, or into the engine again. So let's go ahead and do that next. All right, so if I pan down and look at the engine, I have the dry sump, the scavenge pump installed. As you can see here, again, it's upside down, but and you can see the two lines that are actually tapped into the pan itself. So this is the pickup points for the scavenge pump, and this is the output to return to the oil tank itself. So this is in place now. I'll spin the motor around and continue with some of the other fittings I need. Great. So I'm getting relatively close. Now I'll turn my attention to this clutch cover itself. I use a hydraulic cylinder for my clutch. This is set up for a cable itself, so not a big deal. All I have to do is slide this thing out like this, take the washer, set it aside so I don't lose that. In fact, I'll put it here. And this spring, I can just set these down here for a minute. All I need to do is take off this little end here, so I'm just going to grind that off. It's just a pin through here, and then I'll be able to use that to attach my clevis that I have for my cylinder, okay? So let me do this real quick. So all I did was remove that little rivet, basically held that on, and I can put this thing back in now. There we go, got it. So engine is pretty close to being done. The last thing that I'll do now, I could do it when it's, of course, in the car itself, the engine, but I modify this connector here itself, and I do that because I do not use, let me span over here, I do not use the water temp sensor that's on the engine itself, and that's what part of this wiring is. So I'm just going to remove some of this, trim this thing up, and then put a 2-pin DPN on. The only thing I'm interested in here, this is 2 wires here for the sensor, the trigger wheel sensor, which obviously you need to be able to run the engine, right? All right, so as I'm down here, got a few little miscellaneous things I need to prep for in the motor before it's ready. One is the, these are the knock sensors that I use. Simply a safety thing. I don't have any detonation concerns, so you know, why have them? But anyway, I tune them with Motec some time back, and so I use them for every motor that I put in place. Mounting wise, I just put them on the head here, which is not the ideal location, but being that I have everything tuned for them mounted in this position and the sound levels and everything else, this is what I do. So that's what I'm putting on. All right, next up I'm going to change this. I'm going to change this water pump housing, and it's pretty straightforward. Just use, got a 8mm socket here. Pull this thing off. Again, I use an external thermostat. You could argue you really don't need to. You know, this one does the job for the most part, I would say well, but I like having the bypass thermostat in place, which is what I use. And you know, it's just, oh, in fact, I'm looking at this, I got the wrong one in place here, so I'll have to modify this one since the brackets changed. If you look at year to year, it's a little different, so I'll have to modify this one real quick. All right, so the thermostat housing, it was a little different this year on the 22 motor. They changed this flange for whatever reason, no big deal. So all I did is I removed my thermostat, I plugged the little C-pole here, and I can go ahead and get this thing mounted back on the car. Pretty straightforward. So I removed the, this is the fill hole normally for the engine on the clutch cover. I have an adapter here that I put in place, and I do that because this is the fitting for the breather that you need in your dry sump system. So that's all this is. Well, that's it for this video. Hopefully you found some of the material of interest. Look, not every installation is going to be the same for motorcycle-powered race cars. Some do not have dry sumps as an example, but this was to share what I go through and the steps that I do to prepare my engines for installation. So hopefully that's helpful. But that's it for this video. I appreciate you watching, and I appreciate you sending those comments over, those questions in the channel. I think that's way cool. And of course, when you swing by and see us at the track and wave and introduce yourself, again, for those of you out there and you know who I'm speaking to, very cool. I appreciate that. But that's it for now. Until next time, ciao.